I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this video today is for anybody who's thinking of upgrading their family car this year and you want to get something a little bit more green. Now, last year we spent a lot of time with the new Toyota RAV4 Hybrid. We had one as a long-termer for about 4 months and we couldn't stop singing its praises. It's genuinely frugal in the real world, it's powerful, it's good to drive, and it's really practical as well. But the Toyota has been so successful here in Australia, way more than the brand expected, that Subaru doesn't want to let them have all the fun. So the Forester, which has been pretty popular in new gen form, is now available as a hybrid. But it's a bit more expensive than the Toyota, it's a bit less powerful, but the size is in some ways a little bit better. So in today's video, we're going to be figuring out which is the best hybrid powered mid-size SUV you can buy in Australia right now. We'll start with the RAV4, which has been such a benchmark for the last 12 to 18 months or so, and then we'll check out how the Subaru differs. But before we get started, make sure to hit subscribe down below this video, and then we're going to get into the cabin, the boot space, and the driving. One of the reasons we loved the Toyota RAV4 when we had one as a long-termer was its practical, attractive, and comfortable interior, and the 2020 version of the car doesn't really change any of that. Now, this one has the dark interior with the black leather. You can get optional nutmeg leather, but there's actually quite a weight on those cars because they look more interesting and more upmarket than the darker version. So that's something to keep in mind. But basically, it's actually quite a simple design. Toyota have pared back their interiors of late, and it's actually pretty easy on the eyes, I reckon. So you look forward at a partially digital gauge cluster. It's pretty informative. You can't put a map there, but you can see basically everything else. And you have a hybrid specific tachometer replacement that sort of teaches you to drive it more efficiently. We've got a soft leather steering wheel here, quite a small wheel, so it makes the car feel a little bit more wieldy and agile. Then we look across here, we have a tablet style touchscreen. I know not everyone likes these tacked on style screens, but it's at least high mounted, in your line of sight, really easy to use, and you have wide Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. Wireless smartphone charging on this Cruiser grade, which is always nice, and you can turn it on and off. Big cup holders, really big, decent sized door bins, a deep space underneath here with 2 fast charging old style USB ports and a third one of those up here. Nice tray here that you can put odds and ends into, so it's quite a practical space with a traditional sunroof as well. So up front, there's a lot to like. The electrically adjusted seats are comfortable in particular. What's it like for your passengers in the back? Let's jump in and find out. Well, sitting behind my own 6-foot frame, nice solid sounding door, you'll see that the space is actually pretty decent. So legroom, it's good. Headroom, it's okay. As I mentioned, this vehicle has the sunroof, so there's a bit of a jut out here, but by the time your head is under the roof, it doesn't really matter. And toe room's good. Now the bench is really flat all the way across and the hump in the floor is low, so you can fit 5 people in this vehicle without much of a problem. We also have air vents, those fast charging USB ports as well, bringing the total for the car to 5, and this bench reclines as it is now, so you could see yourself kind of dozing off on a road trip. Plus this Cruiser grade has loads of soft touch materials. It's just a shame that in the cheaper versions, these soft touch doors, front and back, become hard. But all in all, little to complain about and a lot to like. What's it like in the Forester though? That's where we're gonna go now. Here in the Forester, the interior design is definitely a little bit more complicated, but there's still a lot of things to like. The general build quality is excellent, and Subaru's built on their new platform all feel really nicely screwed together, and the Forester is no exception. Especially, there's a bunch of soft touch materials in this car, up here on the dash, on the doors, and even down here where your leg rests, and that's one spot where it has it up on the RAV4, and on a long road trip you are going to notice that. In other ways though, there's a bit of a learning curve. So we have this stack down here, a really nice crisp touchscreen, but it is a lot more susceptible to reflections than the Toyota's matte screen. Then we have an additional screen up here for your trip computer functions controlled by the steering wheel, and we have an additional screen in between the gauges. So learning the technology in this car is going to take a little bit longer than in the Toyota, which is a bit more simple. Speaking of those gauges, they're traditional analog for the most part, and you don't get a custom hybrid gauge in the tack like you do in the Toyota. It just looks like a standard petrol car, so it's a bit harder to know when you're going to tip it over off electric power, although as we'll find out shortly, that's very easy to do in the Subaru. Now we do have very nice comfortable seats in this Hybrid S model. There's a Hybrid L for 40 grand and this Hybrid S for 46 grand, and the S has leather with power adjustment and memory on the driver's side, just like a RAV4 Cruiser Hybrid. There's a little bit of bright work down here as well, which is quite attractive. The steering wheel, it's good to hold, it's a little bit bigger, there's a lot of buttons and paddle shifters on this one as well. And in terms of practicality, we've got an okay amount of storage down here, a little tray, 2 big cup holders, another tray ahead of the shifter, 2 fast charging old style USB ports, but no wireless charging, good sized door bins. So up front, it's reasonably practical, it's reasonably attractive, and it's pretty comfy. Let's check out the second row. Jumping in behind my own frame, you'll see the space on offer in terms of legroom is a little bit superior in the Subaru. I think I've got a touch more. In terms of headroom, I've got a touch less, and that's because of the panoramic sunroof in the Hybrid S that goes a lot further back than the traditional porthole roof in the RAV4. Tow room, lots of that too. Now, you can still get 5 people total into the Forester, though this middle seat is a little bit narrower, I think. The hump in the floor is really low. And in terms of amenities, we do have air vents, 2 fast charging USB ports, flip down armrest with quite shallow cup holders, so you don't want any jumbo size iced coffees or anything like that. Not that kids really drink jumbo size iced coffees, but you know. And in terms of the materials, they revert to hard back here, whereas they are soft in that top spec RAV4. So you can see there are bits and bobs between the cars in terms of which one comes out on top inside. You can let me know your thoughts down below. Next up, boot space. But what about when it comes to boot space? Because even though the Subaru Forester is perhaps a little bit more spacious in the back seat, does that extend to the boot behind this electric tailgate, which does open up really smartly, so you can get into the back of the Subaru quicker. And what you find is a thoughtfully large boot, 508 litres of space. But even though it's really wide, super wide, easy to get things in and out, it's a bit of a short boot. So the Toyota's actually ends up bigger, but you can still get plenty of suitcases in here, no trouble. Plus you have shopping bag hooks, 4 of them, the ability to drop the seats from back here as well, and a cargo cover. But there's a bit of a killer blow for the Subaru for country buyers because there's no spare wheel and tyre. The hybrid batteries sit underneath here. So you have a tyre repair kit and a touch of underfloor storage, but that's it. So if you're going to be doing a lot of country touring, well, a puncture wouldn't be much fun. So just jumping in here with a comment, remember that remark I made about the Forester Hybrid not being maybe so good for country buyers because it doesn't have a spare wheel and tyre? Well, yeah, we've just run into that exact situation. So using the Subaru goo system and trying to pump the tyre back up, just got a puncture out here on the roads we film on. And how many Ks can you drive, John?
5K.
You can drive 5 Ks on the tyre once you've put the sealant in, so you can make up your own mind how appropriate that is for Australia. Whereas we come over here to the Toyota, open up the electric tailgate, which certainly takes more time and it beeps the whole way. But what we find is a smarter boot. So we have 580 litres of space, so it's up by a good 15% or a little bit more than the Subaru. It's longer. It's not quite as wide in terms of the aperture, but it's still good. No load lip, just like the Subaru. Netted area off to the side. No shopping bag hooks, unfortunately, but it's going to be a better touring car because we got a spare wheel and tyre underneath there. Now it's only a space saver, but it's certainly better than nothing. So if you live outside of metropolitan areas, you'd really have to closely consider it. But you can let me know below the video whether the spare tyre thing makes a big difference to you. Next, let's take these hybrids out onto the road. So let's take the 2020 RAV4 Hybrid out for a spin. Now this is a car that if you've been a subscriber for a while, and I hope you have been, you'll be really familiar with because we've spent a lot of time in it, we know it pretty well, and we know there's a lot to like about it and 1 or 2 things that we'd improve in future, and those things stay the same here. Just close that sunroof so we don't have as much noise. Okay, so firstly, the fundamentals of the RAV4 Hybrid. It's pitched as the performance option in the range and also the most frugal. And I think that's a good approach because it looks like one of those sort of no compromises things. It's the one you'd want to buy because the car that sits below it in the range, or the engine below it, is a 2-litre from the Corolla, which sounds maybe a bit too little for a vehicle this big. Whereas the Hybrid is a 2.5-litre petrol engine, naturally aspirated, paired to a decently beefy electric motor, or 3 motors actually in the case of this E4 all-wheel drive version. The combined output is 163 kilowatts, which is up there with cars like the Volkswagen Tiguan 162 TSI, which uses a variant of the Golf GTI engine. So, you know, it is decently quick, and it feels it, both off the line with the instant torque from the electric motor, and also while overtaking on country roads. It feels not rapid, but certainly quick enough to get the job done nice and easily. And that stands in contrast to the Subaru, which uses a really small motor and a small petrol engine, and so you get a more modest result. However, there's also a thing that you might be aware of called right sizing, which is where if you have a vehicle about this size, about this weight, you do want to have enough engine or enough motor so that it's not strained and therefore using more fuel. And that's also the result in the Toyota, because it uses a lot less fuel than the Subaru, much less. But I think that's mostly to do with the power in the electric motor. So it's an 88 kilowatt electric motor. You know, that's more than a Volkswagen Polo's engine, just in the motor. And as such, the electric motor does way more of the heavy lifting in the RAV4. Now we're on a country road here, so the engine's doing bits and bobs, but it's certainly not strained because it's helped along by that electric torque. In fact, we're in EV mode right now, pure EV, 70 k's an hour on a country road uphill. If I put my foot down, it will engage the combustion engine, but they're working together. Off the line in town, the RAV4 is always in EV mode, and if you're light on the pedal, you can accelerate up to 50 or 60, stay in EV. Likewise, not when you're going uphill, but in basically every other opportunity, when you lift the throttle, you'll go back into EV mode. So the Toyota is off combustion so much of the time, and that's how it gets to its figure. It's right sized and it uses less fuel. Plus, there's the sheer refinement of the step from electricity to petrol. It's still not imperceptible, but Toyota, who have been doing the hybrid thing for 20 years, you can tell because that step from electricity to petrol is no longer a harsh clunk vibration like it used to be in an old Prius or an old Camry hybrid taxi or whatever. It's now, you know, you have to be listening for it carefully to hear it. You can't feel it through the seat of your pants or anything. It's really refined. So this is one of those best of all worlds cars. And in our long-termer, we ran it on E10, the cheapest fuel here in New South Wales, and there was no perceptible change in economy or refinement. So this is a cheap car to run. But the RAV4's good hybrid powertrain is not where the good stuff stops, because it's also just a good car to drive in general. It starts with the ride, which is comfort biased, absolutely, but it's properly sprung and damped. It's clearly been through hundreds of thousands of kilometers of tuning, including potentially on our local roads, which it suits very well. It irons out imperfections and bumps beautifully, both on urban roads and country roads, and yet the body control is good. It's not as good as something like a Tiguan or a Skoda Kodiaq, but it's very good. You never feel like you're going to get tossed off the road. You always feel in control. The steering is feel-free, but it's very predictable and doesn't have a dead zone on center. You know, you turn in, you track the line you're looking for, and there's good grip from the Bridgestone Lenza tyres as well. Then there's the refinement. This is a quiet car with very subdued road noise and wind noise, which is a good thing because given that it's in EV mode a lot of the time, you don't want to be hearing tons of road noise. So it's quiet, it's refined, almost Lexus-like. It's very good. Nice cabin too, comfy, good visibility. In terms of stuff the RAV4 can do better, there's a weird brake feel. I mean, that's normal for series parallel hybrids as they kick over between regen braking and actual braking with the disc brakes. And then there is the occasional mechanical noise from the rear suspension. And we found that developed slightly over the course of our long-term ownership of the car. But in this box fresh example, I can't hear it. So it's one of those things that you might just have to watch. But otherwise, quality from this Japanese built SUV seems very high. In terms of safety, there's a good amount of safety kit, but we still have AEB, we have lane keep assist with lane tracing. It's not the most powerful system, but it gets the job done most of the time. I just wouldn't rely on it with your hands off the wheel. I wouldn't do that in any car, to be honest. We have full AEB going forwards. We have blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, and a 360-degree camera in this Cruiser model, and I would just go straight for the Cruiser because it gets all of the fruit. So how does Subaru's new Forester Hybrid compare to Toyota's excellent RAV4 Hybrid? Well, In some ways, the first thing we need to talk about is the fact that, you know, a hybrid is not necessarily the same as a hybrid, and that's that depending on the technology underneath the car, hybrids can be very, very different. So just because these cars are both series parallel hybrid, i.e. they have a combustion engine that works a lot of the time, and they have a small battery and electric motor to assist that combustion engine mainly, the power of the motor and the size of the battery can change things hugely. So we've already talked about how the Toyota has a large-ish battery for a series parallel hybrid and a powerful motor. Here in the Subaru, it's the opposite case. There's a very small battery and a very small, weak motor. So there's a 12 kilowatt electric motor, and that's assisting a 2-litre flat 4-cylinder engine, the same as that used in the Impreza, and it's producing 110 kilowatts of power and 196 newton meters of torque. And you can probably hear it straining up this hill. So it's a fairly modest engine, but for a town car, that's not necessarily that much of a problem, especially if the electric motor gives it enough assistance. The thing is, it's just not a good enough combination to stand up to what the RAV4 is able to do, where not only does the RAV4 have the power in its motor and the size in its battery to actually be able to drive that car for short distances on electric power alone, but the RAV4 also feels fast everywhere. By contrast, the Forester feels very modest in terms of performance, and it's very rarely in EV only mode. So it almost always takes off from zero in combustion, not in EV. It doesn't have that tendency to switch into EV whenever possible when you lift the throttle. So it spends much more time with its engine on, and as a result you end up with the highest thirst of this pair by some margin, by sort of 20 to 30% more fuel consumption in exactly the same circumstances, which is how we tested the consumption of these cars with a largely urban loop, because that's how they're going to spend most of their time. That being said, if your goal is to buy a Forester because you really like the Forester and you want to use less fuel than the standard petrol engine, the hybrid does do that. So in the Forester 2.5, which we reviewed on the channel and you can watch up here, you use about 10 litres per 100 Ks in the same conditions. So by that margin, the Forester Hybrid really does cut fuel economy by a decent margin. It's just that the RAV4 Hybrid does it so much better than its own petrol version and better than this Forester Hybrid. So what about the other driving dynamics? Well, the Forester is really set up for comfort. So it has very springy suspension. It's quite sprung. And that being said, the damping tries to introduce a little bit more road feel back into the equation. So it's perhaps slightly underdamped, I think, in that you do catch sharp edges in town and feel them in the cabin. But that said, on country roads, you just get this very sort of springy ride, which dials out a lot of kind of uncomfortable motion, but you do get sort of springy vertical effect. So you'll need to test drive the car to see whether that's to your tastes. For me, I prefer sort of a more flatter level ride, but it's not uncomfortable. I just don't think it's as, you know, consistent as the Toyota. Then there's the weight transfer in the corner. So you tip it into a corner. If you tip it in, you know, sportily, athletically, if you're used to Subarus from the old days, for example, and there's a significant weight transfer into the front outside tyre and then a big rear end float movement around behind you. And that could be kind of entertaining, but I don't think it's the best attitude for a mid-size SUV. I think a slightly more level attitude in corners, slightly less lurchy movements is what you want. It's not a hybrid thing. The batteries are at the back and they're nice and low, so they wouldn't be causing that. In fact, it's a similar reaction to the normal petrol car. Now, once again, a bit like with the engine, these things matter a little less in town if you're just going to be using the Forester as an errand car. But Australia is a big country, it has a lot of country roads, and so being able to corner really effectively while you're pushing on is, I think, a virtue that mid-size SUVs can aspire to, and that the Toyota manages pretty well. In terms of refinement, it's decently quiet, though there's quite a bit of road noise thrown up from the Bridgestones because the engine is really quiet at idle. So unless you're flaring that throttle, and it does tend to flare a bit with the CVT, there's not a lot to hear mechanically, so there's a lot of road noise as a result. So there's a little bit more noise in this car, in the Subaru. However, you do feel looked after. The brakes are good, And the safety tech, which is all standard, is good. So we have Subaru's eyesight system, the dual camera system. So we have good full AEB, adaptive cruise control. We have lane keep assist that doesn't really work all that well, but it certainly tells you when you're leaving the lane, so that's something. And we have reverse emergency braking as well, which works very, very effectively, and I think is a really important technology on an SUV. So all in all, the Forester, it's certainly not a bad car to drive. It's just not a great car to drive. And as a hybrid, I think Subaru needed to learn some more lessons from Toyota, who have been doing this for a lot longer before launching their first Forester Hybrid, because I think it could have been better than it is. Both of these vehicles make very decent family cars. When it comes to picking a winner, it's actually easy, because it's really clear to us that one manufacturer has poured heart and soul into developing an affordable mid-size crossover with a hybrid engine that really makes a difference to your bottom line in terms of the fuel economy it delivers, while also being a great vehicle to drive. And that vehicle is the Toyota RAV4 Hybrid. Now this Cruiser, the top spec car, is a really complete vehicle, and I have no hesitation in recommending it. But it's also democratic, and you can get a base car with the exact same powertrain and all that goodness for $35,000, $5,000 cheaper than where the Subaru Forester Hybrid starts. The Subaru, it drives relatively well. It's just that the motor isn't powerful enough, the battery isn't big enough to deliver those benefits that a hybrid should be all about in 2020. And that's where the Toyota is simply able to romp home in this comparison. Now let me know what you think below the video, which of these cars you prefer, and while you're down there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell so you never miss any of our full-length Australian video car reviews. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.